Today we're going to be deep diving into the APSC 12mm T2.9 Cine Lens from 7Artisans. I'm going to be testing and comparing it to other Fujifilm lenses, but this info will carry over to whatever mount you got the lens for. And this is going to be a very technical review, hopefully simplified right down so all can understand it. 7Artisans did send me this lens, but they have no say at all in what I say, and also if you keep watching you'll see I try to keep my personal opinions out of this review and just share the facts for you to decide, right up until the very end where I'll share my thoughts. If you just want to jump straight to that part and remove the chance for you to make your own decision, be my guest. Coming in at 610 grams without caps, it is a full metal construction and you can feel it. This lens isn't light if you're comparing it to say its photographic counterparts. The aperture ring is declicked as you'd expect from any cine lens, and it covers T2.9 to T16. As far as how usable these aperture ranges are, I'll cover that off later on in the video. Focus breathing is pretty noticeable if you're doing real long focus pulls, but once again, most lenses have a little, and at this wide, most of your focus adjustments are not going to be noticeable at all. But on the odd time you do need to do some extreme pulls, you could try removing these in post, I guess. And what makes this lens breathing look so noticeable is because its minimum focus distance is only 14 centimeters or 5.5 inches, which is pretty close to touching the front of the lens, and also creates a very long distance to shift your focus over. But I'll also talk more about focusing this lens soon. Now, I know some people really struggle with understanding MTF charts, so I have translated the 12mm MTF results into this style. Essentially, the colors represent how sharp on your sensor your shot will be, with blue being outstanding and red being horrific. For those pixel peepers of you wondering about these results, they are based off 45 lines per millimeter tests. What this means is these results will change in color depending on how fine of detail you try to resolve with this. So for example, they would look better if you did 30 lines per millimeter testing, and that 45 lines per millimeter testing is very harsh testing. You could maybe think of this as how good the lens is for resolving 8K footage. But the results show us one thing. This lens is very consistently sharp all the way across the frame. Like, I can't stress enough how impressively consistent this lens is for how wide it is. If you like a bit of comparison, the Fujifilm 10 to 24mm at 10mm starts off real sharp and falls off very quickly. This is also, I believe, tested at f4 as it's an f4 lens, which is easier to make sharper, but it is wider and a zoom, so harder to make sharper. Take from this what you will. And the same again compared to the Fujifilm 14mm f2.8, which is not as wide, but as you can see is wickedly sharp in the middle and falls off pretty quickly near the edges. And finally, compared to the Rokinon 12mm T2.2 Cinema Lens, which is the closest lens I could find for price and angle, the 7Artisan absolutely smashes it. But once again, the Rokinon is a T2.2 lens, not a T2.9, so this will give it a smidge of credit there. But my point is, this lens is amazingly sharp. And the reason I love consistency with cinema lenses is because if I need to sharpen things up a little in post, I find it much quicker and easier to do so globally to the whole shot rather than try to recover some detail just from the edges, where at this wide things can also get a little perspective warped. But just to recap this, for how wide the lens is, I think it gets very impressive results. And if you're only capturing 4K or 1080 footage, this lens will rock. But even for 8K, or just photographically, this lens is very impressive, especially for its price. Now for testing aberrations, I actually based this off an old Astro test I worked out that measures the size of all aberrations in one hit, including chromatic and spherical aberrations. For those that aren't aware of what aberrations are, these are pretty much like extra flaws that can appear from your lens near edges or high contrast details that reduce detail, but they don't really show up in normal sharpness MTF testing. Now once again, this is very over the top pixel peeping kind of stuff, taken from as far into the corner of the lens as possible, where things are normally the worst. And to really stress how over the top this is, we're looking at this little speck of light at 631% zoom here. Now you'll see that at T3.2 and 3.5 each have question marks after them. This is because the lens does not have markings for these T-stops, and I just took a guess at what they were. But to really simplify down what we're looking at here, at T2.9 and 3.2 there is a bit of chromatic aberrations, which you can see in that blue and purple colours appearing. But then things look pretty good until about T11, where rings start to appear around our little light, showing that spherical aberrations really start to kick in. So what this means, if you're shooting fine detail in high contrast scenes like trees against the sky, keep your aperture as close to t5.6 as possible, as this is the lens's sweet spot, and I'd avoid t11 and t16 altogether if you're shooting 4K or higher video. Moving on to lens flares. Now, flares are a little bit like your taste in art. Some people love them and some people hate all of them, but to be honest, when it comes to flares, my knowledge and taste is pretty limited. Wide-angle lenses are pretty vulnerable to them, but aside from at T16, I never thought them to be too bad. They are a little sharp for my taste, as I prefer a smoother flare with less colour to add a bit more atmosphere instead of distractions. With distortion for this homemade test, what we're looking here is to make sure the vertical lines of the building stay straight with the vertical black bars I've overlaid on this video. Feel free to pause this clip anywhere to see how well things line up, but do note that if we have a bigger gap at the top than at the bottom, that just means my camera wasn't perfectly level. What we're looking for here is a curve to the building and for the verticals to have different spaces from the middle to the edges. And as you can see, distortion is nothing at all to worry about with that lens, though you'll definitely get some perspective warping with any 12mm lens if you start to tilt your shot. With vignetting, this is a very simple test, but also nowhere near as detailed as some of the other tests. I personally don't care too much about a little bit of vignetting and nearly always add a little in post anyway, but there is a real small amount wide open at T2.9 that reduces as you stop down a smidge. Don't worry about it, maybe even embrace it a little, she'll be right. So from watching most of this, things all seem pretty positive, though that doesn't mean I love everything about this lens. For me, its biggest flaw was actually how hard it was to rig up. See, because this lens is so short and wide, trying to attach a lens control system onto my rig in such a limited space without having anything appear in front of the lens was pretty tricky to do. And I have to rebuild my rig from how I prefer it built just to fit it in, though that also does sound like a bit of a me problem. But after I finally got it all set up and did a few practice shots, I realised I wasn't actually needing to shift focus at all. At 12mm around t5.6, pretty much everything, aside from the closest of objects, are sharp. And instead of needing to shift my focus, I hooked my lens control system up to the aperture ring and instead used the lens control system to adjust for light changes. So onto my thoughts about this lens. It's sharp, it's solid, it's compact, it's pretty weighty, but for its price for a cine lens, I think this lens kicks ass. Use it at t5.6 and everything will be sharp and you'll never have to focus again. My name's Thomas, and if you enjoyed the informative nature of this review, please hit the subscribe button, or if you have any questions about this lens, please leave them down in the comments below.